What is going on, guys? So today I'm going to talk to you guys about a topic that I've been asked a lot, and it's one of those things that I was really curious about whenever I was first joining the Army, because I am in the Army Reserves. And one of the things that I was thinking about was, or whenever I was joining was, going into the Army Reserves, do you get the same quality of training that active duty soldiers get? Now, the answer to this question is actually a little bit more complicated than you might think, but I'm going to break it up into a few different parts, right? So I'm going to make this real simple for you guys, and I'm just going to start with letting you guys know about the initial training, right? So if you guys did not know, Army Reserves, Army National Guard, and Army Active Duty all get initially trained the same. So their initial training is always going to be the same because they're going to be trained together. At basic training, you're going to be with all of those different components. At AIT, you're going to be with all the different components. And the same thing goes for officers. Whenever you're training as an officer in ROTC, OCS, or a BOLC like I'm at right now, you are all going to be trained together. So the training that you get should be the same. You're going to get trained with your peers, with the different branches, active, guard, and reserve. So to answer that question, do you get trained the same? Initially, yes. Training is going to be across the board the exact same, no matter if you're active or reserves, right? The difference here, and the difference kind of comes into play whenever you're talking about after you actually finish your initial training. So if you're enlisted, whenever you finish your AIT and you go to your first unit, if you're active duty, you're just going to basically head straight there. If you do hometown recruiting or whatever, it doesn't really matter, but essentially you're going to head straight there. If you're in the reserves or the guard, you may not head straight there. You might actually take a month or 2 months before you actually go to your first ever drill. And just to clarify for you guys, reserves and guard, the amount of training and active duty time or whatever that you're gonna get on a yearly basis is that two days a month, and then the 2 weeks a year on average. And if you do any extra training or whatever, you're gonna get that extra time. But like basically the bare minimum is the 1 week in a month and then the 2 weeks of year. Again, you can do additional training, and you can also be AGR. If you are AGR in the reserves, that essentially means that you are active reserves, and so you're going to be there full time. So you can treat that as like the same thing as active duty. But what I'm talking really about is just reserves drilling monthly, guard drilling monthly, that kind of thing. You can also be guard and be full time as well. So that's kind of something I want to mention there. But the real difference here comes into play whenever you're talking about like training, or is it repetition, right? So people ask me if reserves and active duty get trained the same, like if they're held to the same standard. And yes, actually technically reserves and guard are held to the same standard that active duty soldiers are held to. But the problem is we're not doing it all the time. Like I said, if you're in the reserves, you're doing it 2 days, essentially a month. And a lot of times you might not actually get to do your job that specific weekend. There might be some other crap that you have to do that weekend that takes precedence over doing some kind of training exercise to where you actually get to do your job. Whereas for active duty soldiers, you're active, Monday through Friday, you're doing that as your job, and you get to do a lot more hands-on. Whereas reserves and guard soldiers, you don't get to do as much hands-on. For your annual training, that is kind of like the refresher for you to actually kind of remember and get a lot of hands-on experience doing what your particular job is, whatever that annual training event exercise is. So that will vary a little bit, but essentially that's what that is all for. The 2 days a month that you're going to drills and stuff, like I said, sometimes you're not actually doing your job. Whereas active duty soldiers, I would basically say, every week you're doing something for your job. Maybe not every single day, but at least every week you're doing something and you're repeating your job. You're repeating all these things. So you're going to learn through repetition. And a lot of the things that you do and a lot of things that you learn in the Army are skills that if you don't use it, you'll lose it, right? So if you forget, if you're a 25 Bravo like I used to be, if you learn how to configure switches and routers and do some stuff like that, if you don't use it, which I didn't never use it, then you lose it. Now, whenever I came back here to BOLC as a 25 Alpha, we kind of went over the basics on that. And so I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. But essentially, I never actually used that skill during my time in the reserves. I only learned it during training. Whereas maybe if I was active duty, depending on what unit I was in, I could have actually utilized that skill. But for me, in my unit, I didn't get to use that. And that kind of brings me to my other point that I want to talk about. And that is that this all is very very dependent on your unit that you go to, right? So a lot of the experiences that you're gonna have in the Army, a lot of your experiences you're gonna have in the military are like super duper dependent on the unit that you go to, right? So you can have the same MOS as somebody else in a different unit, but their mission and their personnel and what they're supposed to do is just completely different, right? You can have the same MOS, different unit, you got different missions, you're doing different jobs on a day-to-day basis, right? So that is something that you guys really need to consider, right? So even for the reserves or the guard, you could be in a unit, you know, if you're 24 Bravo, I use Signal all the time as an example because I was Signal 25 Bravo before. I'm a Signal officer now, so that's kind of the example that I like to use a lot. So if you were a 25 Bravo and you were going to drills and you were in a Signal company and your job, they required you to try and get your Security Plus certification, they wanted you to do all this stuff, then yeah, you're going to be using your job a lot more than maybe somebody else who was like myself, who was a 25 Bravo in the transportation unit, which didn't really have that big of a S6 section. It didn't really have that much signal stuff going on, right? So I didn't get to use my skills as much as I would have had liked to. Whereas in my new unit, the soldiers that are in my shop on the S6 OIC, they're gonna get to use their skills, their 25 Bravo skills, their 25 uniform skills, their 25 whatever skills, more than I did at my first unit. So depending on what unit you go to, this is going to vary a lot. But I do wanna mention that as a whole, right? As a whole, initial training is the same. But whenever you get to your first unit, second unit, whatever, active duty soldiers are gonna be doing that basically all the time. Whereas reserve soldiers and guard soldiers, a lot of it is gonna be put on you to actually kind of stay up to date, to actually try to remember stuff and actually try to refresh your skills and things like that. Whenever you go to your drills, you know, actually try to do something for those drills, because sometimes you might go to drill, guard, and reserves, and there's nothing to do, and then there might be some NCOs or something that should be planning some training for you, but they don't. So a lot of it is going to be on you to actually maintain those skills, so that whenever you do deploy as a reservist, as a guard soldier, and you go to deploy and you support some mission overseas or some mission just anywhere else, you're not so far behind. You don't have to refresh your memory on so much stuff, because the reserves is just all support MOSs. There's no combat MOSs in the reserves. And so whenever we deploy, we're deploying to support other people. So it's not like we're in the infantry and we're not doing any platoon tactics. We're not doing any squad tactics. We're not doing any FTXs or anything like that. If you are infantry in the guard, that's probably what, I'm not infantry in the guard, obviously, but that's probably what you're gonna be doing for your drills. You're probably gonna be doing a lot of FTXs and training on your squad tactics and movements and battle drills and all that stuff that you're gonna be learning and practicing your job, right? So that whenever you do deploy, you can actually, you know, perform your job effectively, right? So like I said before at the beginning of this video, reserves and guard are held to the same standard as active duty soldiers, which can be sometimes a strain, because obviously we're not doing the job the same amount of days in a month that other people are. The last thing that I want to mention in this video, which has to do with the equipment, which should be said, this should be said whenever it comes to comparing the training for active duty, guard, and reserve soldiers, and that is 99 times out of 100, active duty soldiers are going to have the more up-to-date equipment than reserve soldiers. In some cases, guard, the Army National Guard, they might have some more updated equipment because they need to communicate and operate effectively with the civilian sector, right? So they need to work with them. But reserves, you're just in support of the federal Army, the US Army, right? So not the National Guard, the actual active duty Army. So you get a lot of hand-me-downs, right? So some of the stuff that you get is, you know, 20 years old, 30 years old, you know, things like that. And it's not really the up-to-date equipment that you're going to use overseas when you're deployed, wherever you're at. Active duty components, they're gonna get that before the reserve soldiers get that. That's just basically how it works. So I do wanna mention that if you're active duty, you will more than likely be working on more up-to-date equipment than reserve or guard soldiers. So that's something that I do want to mention, but that doesn't mean that working on the outdated equipment is just completely pointless, because essentially anytime you're working on equipment in the military, the new equipment is obviously just an updated version, right? So let's say you're using Windows 7 on your PC. If you're proficient at using Windows 7, Windows 10 rolls out, you know, you're not totally lost in the sauce. You can still kind of figure your way around and you can learn things a lot more quickly. When you go to the more updated equipment, you're going to be able to pick up on it a lot easier. So I'm not saying that it's totally pointless that reserve or guard soldiers are using that more outdated equipment. You need to be proficient at that, and if you're proficient at that, then whenever you move and, like, so let's say you get deployed and you fall in on some equipment that's the new stuff, you're actually going to know what's going on. that is gonna be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button. That would be awesome. If you're interested in some more of my videos, hit that subscribe button. That would be even better. Follow me on Instagram and Snapchat if you haven't already. Hope you guys have an amazing freaking day, and I'll see you later.